First of all, many thanks to SteelOrbis and IREPAS for inviting me to be here. Good morning, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Frank Zhong from Worldsteel Association. It's my pleasure to be here presenting our outlook about the Chinese steel market. So in addition to outlook about the Chinese steel demand, I'm also asked by the conference organizer to talk about the progress of decarbonization of the Chinese steel industry, also China's annual strategy or China's strategy to secure its annual supply. I will start my presentation with a few slides about the Chinese demand outlook. First of all, is about global picture. This picture was just released 3 weeks ago. According to our forecast, global steel demand will rebound by 2.3% this year, and followed by a mild recovery of 1.7% the next year. So this is a global picture. So you can see the steel demand in 2024 is going to be historical high. This is about global steel demand. So this global steel demand is going to be historical high. This is a regional overview. You can say on average, the world is going to be 2.3% higher than last year. But region by region, it's quite different. In terms of China, steel demand is going to be 2% higher than last year. And next year, we believe the steel demand is going to be flat. And the world, excluding China, or the world without China, will be performing better than China. So for 2023, the world without China will grow by 2.6%. And next year, China's steel demand is going to be flat, but the rest of the world will grow by 3.6%. And out of the rest of the world, you can see the other Europe here means actually many in Turkey, which is going to be very strong, 7.4% growth, followed by 6% in the next year. And Russia and Ukraine plus other CIS countries will continue to decline by 3.5%, followed by another decline of 4.3%. There is also, let's say, very strong, is a region with a strong growth, like developing Asia, excluding China, which many includes India and Southeast Asia. Their steel demand in 2023 will continue to grow by 6.9%, followed by another 6% growth next year. So this is region by region. You can see China has been underperforming the rest of the world last year, this year, and next year. Why China has been underperforming in terms of steel demand growth? I think there are two main reasons. One is the Chinese steel demand is approaching historical peak. Or China's demand has already passed, might have already passed historical peak. This is number one. Number two is from in short term, the Chinese steel demand was hit hard by the zero COVID policies in the past 2 years. So the Chinese GDP growth was very low, 3% last year, but we see strong exports last year. Will this continue to happen this year? I think there's uncertainty. In terms of GDP growth, I think this year is going to be much stronger. Like in Q1 this year, the economy grew by 4.5%, and the expectation for Q2 this year is going to be 8%. So it can grow as strong as 8%. So average growth in first half of this year is going to be 6%. However, even though the economy is going to grow very strongly, but you can see the components of the growth or the contribution to the growth is quite different. The private consumption is going to be the main driver for the Chinese economy. You know, private consumption is much less steel intensive, while investment, the role or the contribution to China's economy will be only roughly 37%, which is much lower than the previous 3 years. Also, China's fixed assets investment also, let's say, industrial production are also expected to remain stable. Infrastructure investment will remain strong, and you can see real estate investment. The chart on your right hand side, you can see the real estate investment is still in the negative zone, but we see a sign of stabilization. So it's still negative growth, but the growth is less negative. This is the economic outlook for China in terms of GDP growth. Many organizations are forecasting China's economy is to grow by roughly 5 to 5.5%. But I think most of the Chinese economists they believe that the Chinese economy can grow by roughly 6%, even a little bit higher than 6%, because they expect the Q2 to grow by already 8%. And in some COVID measures, it have already been completely abolished, and it's unlikely more any new COVID related measures will be introduced, and the infrastructure will continue to support the growth, but we do not expect any radical new measures to be introduced for the real estate or for the housing construction. And demand for exports, demand for exports of Chinese manufactured goods may decline for worsening global economic outlook. So briefly, our outlook for China's steel demand is we have two scenarios. This base scenario, we assume that the Chinese economy will become the top priority of the growth will become the top priority of the Chinese government, and there will be no new stimulus measures to be introduced in this year. But alternatively, if the economy is growing not as strong as the government expected, they may introduce some new stimulus measures to make sure the GDP growth can be as high as 5.5%. In this case, demand could be stronger. So this is base scenario and alternative scenario. I think many organizations are expecting China's steel demand to be negative growth in 2023, but I think they are too conservative, too negative. And my view is that China's steel demand may grow by 2% this year. Actually, a Q1 number is plus 1.8%, or so almost 2% growth in Q1. And also, it's likely the demand could be slightly higher because the second half of last year, the base was very low. So from base point of view, I think the Q3, Q4 of this year could be stronger than 2%. This is China's steel demand growth sector by sector. You can see you were mainly driven by construction sector, 2.5% this year, followed by electrical equipment and mechanical machinery. So this is about a brief outlook about steel demand, and about China's share in global steel demand. You can say it's interesting. In the year of 2020, the China's share in global steel demand was 56.3%. Personally, I believe this is a historical high. And now you can see China's share in global steel demand has been declining over the past 2 years, and we also expect this decline will continue in the following year. It's unlikely Chinese share will revisit the historical high, 56% in following years. In the meantime, but you can see India's share is growing. In 2020, India represented only 5% of the global steel demand, but in 2024, India will represent more than 7% of the global steel demand. Now, let me share a little bit my view about this decarbonization of the steel industry in China. Actually, decarbonization has not been an issue of the Chinese steel industry until September 2020, when the Chinese President Xi Jinping announced the Chinese, let's say, carbon neutrality ambitions. So over the past 2 years and a half, decarbonization has been a topical issue in China, and the decarbonization has been progressing very fast, extremely fast in China. In most of the regions in the world, I think the decarbonization has been pushed by policy. In China, I think it's more or less the same. So I have taken some time to summarize the policies introduced in China to push forward the decarbonization in the Chinese steel industry. For the first one is a national action plan for carbon peaking by 2030, which was published October 2021. There isn't too much information specifically for steel, but they want to push the merger and acquisitions. They want to substitute Korean energy with it's fossil energy with Canadian energy, something like that. Then the second one is the implementation plan for carbon peaking in the industry. sector by 2030, which was just issued in July last year. I just have some words highlighted in red color, which was specifically for steel industry. You can say they wanted to promote low carbon technologies to be applied with focus on EAF development. And in terms of scrap supply, they hope that the certified steel recycling enterprises, the capacity to reach 180 million tons. Certified steel scrap means actually those legal recycling enterprises. In China, the scrap recycling sector is very complicated. There are a number of steel scrap recycling companies. They are not legally registered, so they are not regulated. In total, China's scrap generation last year was about 250 million tons. Out of this 250 million ton scrap generation, maybe only 100 or 120 million ton. The companies are this scrap were collected with companies legally registered, and the EAF-based steel production. The share will reach 15% by 2025 and also 20% by 2030. Probably you know, currently the EAF steel production represents only 10% of the Chinese total steel production. Now the government now is looking at 30% of the EAF steel production by 2035. They also want a breakthrough in the hydrogen enriched blast furnace, also hydrogen-based DRI production and CCUS in following years. Well, the last one is action plan for carbon peaking for the Chinese steel industry by 2030. This policy was more or less ready in the beginning of last year. The government wanted to publish this policy, but for some sensitive reasons, so it was not published. The original proposal was for the Chinese steel industry to peak its carbon emission by 2025, but at the end of the day, the industry, also the government agencies, they found that probably this is too aggressive, too risky, so they decided to postpone, to change the deadline for carbon peaking to 2030. And this is about the national hydrogen strategy, the Eastern March for hydrogen use in the steel industry. So you can say the Chinese government is very ambitious about hydrogen production in China. Currently, China is producing roughly 35 million tons of hydrogen a year, and this capacity might be tripled in 15 years. But the use of hydrogen in the steel industry is not high, does not have any high priority in the Chinese national hydrogen plan. There are also some other policies, but it's not very specific for the steel industry. For instance, the national emission trading system, which was introduced 2 years ago, and the government wanted to include steel into the national emission trading system this year or next year, but unfortunately, because the steel industry has not been ready, especially for data, because most of the Chinese steel makers, they don't have data for their carbon emission. So now government now is pushing hard the Chinese steel makers to prepare for their data of carbon emission reporting and joining the emission trading system. But they still hope that the steel can be included in the national trading emission trading system by year 2025. And in the industry, CESA here stands for China Iron Steel Association. They have also come up with a decarbonization roadmap for the entire Chinese steel industry. They have identified 6 pathways to carbon neutrality by 2060, which includes efficiency improvement of the existing facilities, maximize use of scrap, process optimization, breakthrough technologies, promotion of high performance and long-life steels. And they have also worked out a so-called 4-phased decarbonization roadmap, and according to the national plan, the hope that the carbon emission can come to a peak by 2030. But actually, this is very conservative. My personal view is that the emission of the Chinese steel industry will come to a peak very likely by 2025 or even earlier. And by 2040, they hope the emission can be reduced by 40% via efficiency improvement, also scrap use compared to the peak level. And by 2050, with the introduction of breakthrough technologies, the steel emissions can be reduced as much as 85% compared to the peak level. And by 2060, the emission can be reduced by up to 95% by use of mixed solution. So this is about the industry association. And in terms of steel makers, the leading steel makers have taken some radical actions like HBAS Group, which is producing 40 million ton, 45 million ton of crude steel a year. They have pledged to peak its carbon emission in 2022, which means this company's emission has already peaked last year. And China Bao Group, the largest steel maker in the world, has pledged to peak its carbon emission this year, which means for China Bio Group, it's still emission from steel making operation will remain flat or decline in the following years. And most other Chinese steel makers have announced to peak their emissions during 2025 to 2030. And a number of R&D projects for low carbon breakthrough technologies are being conducted. And so far, there is no funding from the government. So all funding actually are offered by the Chinese steel makers. And also hydrogen-based DRI capacity are being installed. Here I just show you just two pictures. The two most important DRI hydrogen-based DRI project. One is owned by HBAS, which has been completed at the end of last year. So now it's in trial operation, capacity 1.2 million ton hydrogen-based DRI. And actually they use this hydrogen-based DRI production to feed its steel-making operation. And this steel-making operation will produce automotive steel for BMW. And the Bao Groups, they're also building 1 million ton hydrogen-based DRI plant. This plant is going to be operational at the end of this year. And also EAF share remains slow. Yeah, now the Chinese government now is very anxious to increase EAF production in the Chinese steel industry. And according to the implementation plan for the carbon peak in the industry sector, the government wanted the EAF-based production share to reach 15% by 2025. Now they are looking 30% by 2035. And the national policy for capacity swap is also supportive of EAF development. So if we want to shut down your old-fashioned capacity, you want to replace them with EAF technology, they will allow you to build a little bit bigger capacity. However, if you want to just replace your existing blast furnace with new blast furnaces, you have to reduce your capacity by 20%. And also some provincial governments will also have set some specific targets for EAF in the region. For instance, the Hebei province, they produce 250 million ton a year. They also have targeted to increase its EAF production, EAF share from currently only 5% to 15% in 10 years. But the China's EF share is still low compared to other countries. Like most of the major steel making countries in the world, they have higher than 20% in terms of EF share. But China, it's only 10%. Also, scrap supply actually is concerned. China has been the largest scrap producing country in the world from 15 years back. As I said earlier, China is now is producing 250 million ton of scrap a year, and this scrap supply will continue to grow. According to China's, let's say, the expectation of a so-called Chinese circular economy plan, the China's steel scrap supply will go up to 320 million ton by the year of 2025. And according to CAM is the Scrap Recycling Association, their projection is that China's scrap supply, domestic scrap supply will increase to 400 million ton by 2040. This kind of projection is more or less in line with Worldsteel Association's projection. And China's EF share in 2030 is expected to be higher than government target because we expect the Chinese steel production will decline from currently 1.0 million ton to roughly maybe, let's say 900 or 950 50 million ton. In meantime, the EF capacity is still expanding, and also scrap supply is growing very strongly. So with this assumption, I think that the EF share can be much higher than the government target of 20%. However, there are also some issues on scrap use in China because the quantity is growing, but the quality is deteriorating. So the quality is getting worse. Also, cost is another issue. So far, China's total EAF capacity is about 200 million ton, but the capacity utilization is very low. It's only 50%. But the highest one was only 50, let's say 60 or 65% over the past 2 to 3 years. But now it's only 50%. Many reasons because of the EAF produced steel products are more expensive. On average over the past 10 years is about maybe $20 to $60 per ton more expensive via EAF route. Also, logistics also is an issue because most of the Chinese steel makers are located in North China, while the scrap generation is mainly from Central and South China. South China, in North China, it's much less urbanized, also industrialized. So logistics is also issue. And if in terms of import, the Chinese policymakers wanted to import more scrap into China, but they have set up very high criteria for imported scrap. So in over the past 2 years, on average, China imported only 500,000 tons of scrap. Also, I don't expect a very strong increase in scrap imports in the following years. So this brief view about China's decarbonization. The last the 2 or 3 slides about the China's strategy. From this chart, you can see China has been the major driver of global pig iron production. From this chart, you can see over the past 22 years, the world without China, the pig iron production has been flat. There was almost no growth, no increase in pig iron production in the rest of the world. Only China. So China contributed roughly 95% of the global pig iron production increase over the past 20 years. So as a result, China also contributed 95% of the increase in global iron ore trade. And also China have to rely on let's say imports to satisfy its iron ore demand. So the chart on your right hand side shows the China's iron ore supply structure. Over the past 10 years, imported iron ore accounted for roughly 85% of the Chinese total iron ore consumption. So only 15%, or roughly 10 to 15% of iron ore supply is from China's domestic mines. So this is a big concern of the Chinese steel makers, also Chinese policymakers. So in January last year, CISA, China Iron Steel Association, they come up with a proposal, which is named as Cornerstone Initiative. They aim to secure Chinese iron ore supply from both Chinese domestic iron ore mines, or also overseas mining investments by Chinese companies. And once actually this initiative was agreed, was approved by the Chinese government. So now they have regular meetings almost every quarter and involving various stakeholders. They have also launched some new projects. These projects will be able to produce roughly 10 to 20 million tons of iron ore concentrate per year. And this chart shows China's domestic iron ore supply concentrate equivalent. You can see in the year of 2021, Chinese domestic iron ore production was almost 430 million tons. But afterwards, you can see the Chinese domestic iron ore declined sharply because of the environmental campaign, which pushed some small-sized iron ore mines to shut down. Also, the imported iron ore are much cheaper in terms of input cost. So yeah, they are much more competitive. Now the ambition is to increase China's domestic iron supply to 370 million tons by year of 2023, which means last year China's domestic iron ore supply was only 260 million tons, and they wanted to increase the supply by 100 million ton in 3 years. I think it's a challenge. By 2030, they wanted to the Chinese domestic iron supply to revisit the previous high of 400 million ton. I think it's very challenging because most of the low-hanging fruits have been picked or already. So there are still some reserves, some new mines to be explored, but the cost is very high. The last slide up on my presentation is about the Chinese ambition to expand iron ore mines abroad, and currently Chinese iron ore imports through their investment overseas is about 120 million ton. You know China is importing 1.1 billion ton a year. All of this 1.1 billion ton imports, 120 million ton are imported from Chinese investment overseas, mainly from Australia, Brazil, Chile, and South Africa. And a few iron ore projects are being built and planned in many Africa, like Kenya, Sierra and Liberia, and the more projects are going are being considered, and they have an ambition. In 2022, the imports through Chinese invest iron ore mines was only 120 million ton. They want to increase this number by 100 million ton just in 3 years. I think the majority of this increase will come from the cemento project in Kenya plus a few small projects. So this concludes my presentation. Thank you so much for your attention. I'm happy to I'm happy to take any questions if you have. Thank you.
Thank you. We've got questions. Microphone is coming.
Thank you for your presentation. And I'm glad that you did mention about the decarbonization policies that you all have. And that's wonderful. But I noticed something that you did say that the efforts will peak in 2030. So that means you are still going to build and pollute until 2030. So I thought that by now you would be stopping any more, carbonization from this point on and go downwards. But you're still saying that you're going to go and peak until 2030, which is another 7 years that they will continue to increase your quantities of the carbonization. Is there any real policy to really stop and decrease? Because I noticed that you're also saying that electric arc furnace that you're going to change from the 17% to 20% 2020, which is fine. But what else are you doing, and why are you not stopping the new increase in the carbonization?
Thank you for your question. I think the government changed the deadline for carbon peaking from 2025 to 2030. I think not because they want to emit more CO2, just because they are not sure if China's steel demand will continue to grow or not. So previously they believe China's steel demand will come to a peak before 2025. So with this assumption, they think the steel production will also come to a peak. But later on, because of the competition between China and US, there is this proposal that probably China have to renounce its domestic market. China have to continue to boost its construction market. In this case, the steel demand could be the peak of steel demand could come later than 2025. So to be safer, to be more to be safer, to be less risky, so they come up with more conservative target. But what I heard from the industry, from policymakers, they all believe that even though they have announced the target, conservative target 2030, but it's almost 100% sure the emission will come to a peak before 2025. It all depends on the production as well as the demand. And the government is not really not interested in growing the production. They wanted to restrict the production. They want to restrict the capacity production. They also recently want to restrict the steel exports. They have prepared a policy, export duty, in case China's steel export continue to grow very strongly. They will introduce export duty to reduce exports of steel, because they really want to reduce imports of iron ore and imports of coking coal. Thank you.
Thank you for the presentation, Frank. I got two questions. Number one is there has been some consolidation going on in the Chinese steel industry. So what is your prospect about this? How do you think that it's going to evolve in the coming years? And the second, does Chinese steel industry have also intention to have some acquisition outside of China, as the Russians or the Indians have done so far? Thank you.
Thank you. This is a question is very interesting. Yes, the acquisition, the consolidation in the Chinese steel industry actually is progressing very well quickly over the past couple of years. I think the acquisition can be consolidation can be divided into two categories. One category is pushed by the government, like China Bao, and it's mainly initiated or supported by the government. So China Bao increased its capacity very quickly from only 50 million ton now to 150 million tons. So with the support from the government and its ambition, also related to your second question, is ambition to go up to 200 million tons. Very likely, be probably by the end of this year or next year, China Bao will become 200 million ton. There is a rumor that they also wanted to go up to 300 million ton in the following years. I'm not sure if this ambition will come true or not. This is first category. The second category actually is from the private sector. Some private steel makers like Shaoliang, like Jianong, they are all 40 million ton a year. There's also let's say trying to acquire some private steel makers. There's no government support for them. They have to pay for everything. There's a competition among these private steel makers. Like they Static Special Steel, which is the largest special steel maker. They're producing 20 million ton special steel a year. They just acquired a Nanjing Steel. There is a competition between Static and Shaoliang. And the Jianong, they just acquired this underperforming steel mills around the country. So the capacity also grew very quickly from only 50 million ton to now, or almost 50 million ton. This just happened in 5 years. But of course, they always realized, especially Baowu, they think it's a shame that Baowu, such a big company, the world's largest steel companies, all of these steelmaking facilities are concentrated in China. So China Bao would have its overseas or its steelmaking operation outside China is zero. So China Bao's ambition is to make sure the first overseas steelmaking operation can be operational in 2 years. So in the following years, I think they will continue to expand its steelmaking operation outside China. But taking over or acquiring non-Chinese steelmakers, it's difficult for them. Like HBS acquired the Serbia Steel Company 7 years ago, and the Jianong Group acquired a small steel maker in Malaysia, and the Jinya Steel, private steel maker, took over British Steel. So this is only three cases. And for the next year and the next couple of years, I think the chance is very low for them to take over non-Chinese steel makers because of the culture difference. It's really difficult for them to manage those acquired assets. Thank you.
Any other questions? I may ask the last question, if you don't mind.
Yeah.
You said the government will not tolerate increasing exports. Is there a certain level of quantity maybe that the government may start feeling unhappy about the exports out of China?
Yeah, actually, there is no specific target or let's say cap over the exports. I think last year and the year before there was a growth in the exports, but then there was also a strong increase in iron ore prices because China has to rely on import iron ore price, and also the policymakers become very unhappy, so they want to minimize China's imports of both iron ore and coking coal. So one of the solutions is to minimize China's exports of steel products. So the policy, the export duty was almost ready, but all of a sudden you can see there was a decrease in China's steel exports. So I'm not sure if this export duty will be introduced this year or next year or not. But it's clear the government, the policymakers are not happy if the Chinese exports continue to grow. Instead, actually now they are encouraging imports of steel into China. So now they are supporting imports of semi-finished products, also finished products. They're also supporting imports of DRI. Anyways, just want to minimize imports of iron ore and coking coal.
Thank you very much. So we don't have any other questions. Thank you very much, Mr. Zhong.